As we continue our study of the book of Genesis, we continue with chapters 17 to 19, and we cover really four stories in essence. We cover, first of all, the story about Abraham and the beginning of the whole practice of circumcision, and then we go on with God's conversation with Abraham that looks at two factors. First of all, that Abraham and Sarah will have a son, which was also mentioned in the previous chapter, and that God is going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah if there are not at least 10 righteous found in the land. And then in chapter 19, we actually have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with an explanation about where the Moabites and the Ammonites come from. So let's go back and start with the instructions to Abraham about circumcision. We don't know exactly why this practice was carried out in various parts of the world. It's known not just among the Jewish people, but also among other peoples at various times and places, though nobody quite around in that very area around Canaan had that practice. Something here must be connected with the whole concept of having children and bearing children, and something to note that the foreskin is the place from which the seed comes forth that will cause descendants to come. And we really don't know a whole lot more than that. There's a lot of speculation about what is all involved with this, but no one really knows for sure. It was a very ancient custom, and people in previous times seem to have done circumcising as well, based on depictions of nude figures in pyramids and such. The idea that we have here really is an idea that all of the males are going to be identified as specially part of the people of God. I have a little note to myself in the top of my Revised Standard Version Bible that I've used for years that says, maybe if God had told Abraham many years earlier to install or to start the rite of circumcision, maybe he wouldn't have had to wait so long to have Isaac. But here God says, okay, once you are all circumcised, you and everyone in your household, then you will be ready for me to give you a child. And it takes a little bit of time after this yet, after the story of the Sodom and Gomorrah events. But as this is now instituted, we note first of all that every male was to be circumcised on the 8th day. Some have made a connection to the practice of infant baptism, saying that this is an activity which God does, where he marks really the people who are his, and that the Jewish boys didn't have to wait until they were grown up before they decided whether they wanted to be part of the covenant people. They were part of the covenant people. And I think there's at least a helpful comparison when there are some people who say, well, we don't think we ought to have baptism until someone can make their own choice. That would deny the fact that because of original sin and because of our fallen will, that we would not be able to choose for God unless God had first of all come to us. Well, Abraham and his son Ishmael, who's 13 at this point, and all of those in his household, remember that there were 318 servants that he had back in chapter 14, they are all circumcised. Many people would see this as the beginning of bringing others within the Jewish family, and that would be the way in which God would bring a blessing to people. It is really at issue and at stake in the New Testament when there is a question about whether all of the believers, all of the Christians, would have to become circumcised first before they could be Christian. And you might remember the discussion that takes place in Acts 15 at the First Jerusalem Council, where Paul talks over whether or not the Gentile Christians are going to have to become Jewish first. And the answer is no. It's the same issue that's involved in the letter to the Galatians in southeastern Turkey, where Paul says, who's bewitched you that now you've gone back to having to have certain practices that make you qualified for God's love? And the tendency is there, what do I have to do for God? This activity of circumcision is not doing something to qualify. It is something that simply says everyone who is part of this covenant people is marked by God. It's not quite the same as a um, uh, kind of a thing that we would have today with our baptism and Holy Communion with our sacraments. It is not a sacred action in quite the same way, and yet it very definitely says those who are in the body of believers are marked thus, that the males are marked thus. There is no biblical practice of circumcising females, though that is done also in modern cultures, sometimes in an effort to say that this will take away some of the desire on the part of the women. And some Jewish cults practice female circumcision as well, but there's nothing in the Bible about that. Um, what we find, though, is as God installs or institutes this kind of circumcision, he is once again promising Abraham, though Abraham is 100 and his wife is 90, that he is going to have a child, and it's not going to be Ishmael. That's stated very clearly. God says, no, there'll be a child, you'll call his name Isaac. And that then is the third stage, really, in this chapter in the promises that God makes to Abraham. God comes to Abraham first in chapter 12 and says, leave your country and your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. Then in chapter 15, he takes him out and shows him all the stars of the heavens and makes that covenant where that fire pot comes flying through in the middle, and God obligates himself. And now a third stage where circumcision is also built into the relationship as a special mark for those who are part of the covenant people. And it's promised that God will watch over this people and that the covenant will be an everlasting one. We've looked at this a little bit in terms of what we see in Romans 9 to 11. But regardless of what else is going on, God says, I never change my promise that I will bring a blessing to you. The discussion that is involved is really about whether that means forever or till the end of a particular age. And the New Testament would sort of suggest that the end of this age that begins with Abraham comes with Christ. And that's the way Paul seems to talk, so that the promises do not fall away where they are not any longer applicable to the Jewish people, but that they're expanded so that you don't just have a particular country or land, but that eternal life and what we call heaven would be sort of the much bigger version of that. Anyway, in chapter 18 then, we have this very strange depiction of three figures who are walking by the oaks of Mamre, and we might note that there are certain places where trees are very important, and here at the time of Abraham there's a tree there at the oak of Mamre, right near Hebron, near where Abraham was eventually buried. Sometimes people connected trees with places for teaching, and the word Morah, the oaks of, at Morah, which is right near there, means the word for teaching. And we don't know exactly what Abraham's role is in this community, but he sees some strangers walking by, and we find now this kind of a care for those whom one does not know. It would be very easy to let someone who is a stranger walk by on the other side. And we find a little bit here in a very good sense about the heart of Abraham, who sees strangers, much like Lot, who sees strangers and welcomes them into his home. And as Abraham sees these men, he says, stop, and they prepare a meal. And he realizes that there are human figures who are speaking to him for God. There's nothing in the text here that suggests that the one who stays is Jesus already taking on a human form in the Old Testament, though that has been suggested at times. And people who would say that God was acting through Jesus in terms of wisdom and here and at other times and places, really are reading something in the text that as you read it, there's nothing at all to be said for this being Jesus. We find a kind of an uncomfortable relationship that we'll see again, whether it is God himself that speaks or human figures, whether God comes through a human form and just apparently is human, or whether these are real human beings through whom God speaks as one might speak through a prophet in later times. But very definitely Abraham is aware of the fact that God is talking to him through this, unlike a vision that he might have in chapter 15. And the discussion, first of all, revolves around the fact that Abraham and Sarah will indeed have a child. The tension that's been going all the way through the story until now. Will God keep his promise? For us, it's just a very few chapters and just 1 week of study. But for Abraham, it was something that lasted over a quarter of a century. And those who have waited for a long time for something can very easily give up on it. Abraham had left his country and his father's house. He has many descendants, or many people in his household, but his only descendant is Ishmael, and God says, no, you and Sarah will have a child. And finally then we have this little bit about the laughing, because the word Yitzhak, from which the word Isaac comes, is the word for laughing or having a real joke on someone. And by this point already, the ages are coming closer to the ages we're used to, and everyone would have laughed to hear that a 90-year-old lady who'd never had a baby before was all of a sudden pregnant. When this laughing takes place, Sarah denies that she laughed, and we have this kind of uneasy tension that gets into the story as well about whether or not they really do believe it, and whether this is something to be trusted. Obviously, as I've kind of said a little bit with tongue-in-cheek before, the only thing that Abraham was to do once he got into the land was try to get his wife pregnant, and if she wasn't pregnant, then he was to keep trying. That was what God told him would happen, and he was to be faithful to the promises of God. This is not a kind of a birth on the similar level as Jesus being born of the Virgin Mary. This is a man and a woman who are going to have a child together, and God says, even though you've tried to come up with other ideas, I'm the one who has said you and your wife will have a baby, and I want everyone to know that it has happened in a way where everyone will know this is a miraculous child. This is one who has come by the gift of God and not simply by human desire. So anyway, after the assurance of this child that is going to be born within a year or so, at the springtime of the next year, then we have the discussion with the one figure who remains, while the other two go on, the discussion where God says, am I to tell Abraham what I'm going to do? And Abraham, again, showing the side of care and concern, even for people whom he obviously knew were wicked as well, pleads that if there are only 10 righteous in the city, that God would spare the city. To be sure, he is thinking about his nephew Abraham, or his nephew Lot, and Mrs. Lot, and the two Lot girls. Their names are not mentioned, and he's hoping maybe that there is someone else. I think it's instructive here also to recognize that we usually think in terms of, well, there must be some nice people, and there are people whom God would like because they're kind and loving. But the real point of the story is that God says here, there are no righteous ones. There are none at all who are righteous before him. None at all who are at peace with him. Every human, curved in on self, is going to be under the power of that condemnation and that wrath of God. And there is no point at which God says it's okay to just accept people as they are. He says, finally, every single one of them will be punished. Now, we usually have people say, well, these human beings in Sodom and Gomorrah were very, very wicked, and that God would probably treat people who try real hard and who are very nice in a much different way. But the scriptures say that the Pharisees are in just as much trouble as the publicans are, and obviously we're on the publican side here. The people in the city of Sodom, when these two messengers come to Lot's house, say, bring the men out that we may know them. And we get into the sense of yada, the Hebrew word for know, in a sexual connotation. This will be used much, much later in the city that Saul comes from, where some people within the tribe of Benjamin also mishandled a girl, a secondary wife of a Levite man, and raped her. Again, the same idea was they really wanted to have sex with the Levite man himself. And so here's where we get the word sodomy from, sexual relations that are unnatural, uh, the idea that the men who are visitors will be used as the partners for those who want some new flesh. Uh, God strikes, or these messengers are helped by God to strike the people outside the door with blindness. It's also been very troublesome for people to realize that Lot said he would put his daughters outside and they could have sex with them. But there is an ancient Near Eastern custom that says if you take someone under your roof, if you're willing to take them in, that you would die rather than let them be harmed. In a very nice sense, this is the same thing that God does for us when he says, I've brought you into my house, I want you with me, and I would die rather than let you be harmed, which is exactly what happens. Now, that's sort of like a shadow of things to come, not a definite prediction or anything like that. But as the messengers say to Lot that he is to leave, God is showing here, not like the flood where every human was wiped out, but in the case of these wicked people, that he was going to let them have the consequences of their own wicked behavior. You might remember that these people of Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim and Zoar, those 5 cities, were the people whom Abraham had rescued. God had been merciful to these people, and it's not even here as if somehow God just came blasting his way in and just decided to punish them. They had experienced mercy and then turned it around and said to Lot, you're a stranger here, why in the world should we listen to you? Who do you think you are anyway? Not remembering any longer that it was Lot's relative who had kept all of them from being slaves in a faraway country. So in a certain sense here as well, it is a rejection of God's mercy to the people through Abraham, which is now catching up with them. Just like the chance that Pharaoh had when Abraham was down in Egypt, when he throws Abraham out, instead of seeing that this is someone through whom God can work. Later the people of Egypt also are going to have that same problem come back around and catch them. Lot's son-in-laws don't think much of the deal. There are technically 3 who are righteous because Lot's wife turns back, but the 2 daughters, when they get their father drunk so that he will get each of them pregnant, one with Moab and one with Ammon ben Ami, which are the peoples who live east of the Jordan, just north of the Dead Sea, the Moabites, and those who live up by the Sea of Galilee, the Ammonites, whom we're going to see later in the Old Testament story as people who would get in the way of Israel going into the land of promise. The daughters really don't appear very righteous either, deciding that they will get their father to get them pregnant so that they can have descendants, since no other man would ever get married to them. And in some ways Lot doesn't seem very righteous in that he lets his daughters get him drunk. So really this is not exactly a high point. It's sort of like even those who were seen to be sort of righteous. Lot's wife dies. The 2 son-in-laws stay and are destroyed in the conflagration. Lot himself and the 2 daughters don't come off very well. But in this whole story, once again, we find out that God's mercy is not based on people who are righteous and deserve it, but it's based on those with whom God simply is going to act in spite of what they have done. The archaeological record has not turned anything up for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. It has usually been suggested that the cities were at the southern end of the Dead Sea, where the land is a little bit flatter and it's not so deep. And I've not heard anything recently, but the Dead Sea is actually drying up. The waters are being diverted by both the country of Israel and now the country of Jordan, so that very little water is going into the Dead Sea anymore, and the waters are going down. And so the southern end of the Dead Sea used to be kind of flat, and then there was kind of a tongue of land that came out, and then it was a little bit deeper, and now where that tongue of land came out, now you can go all the way across there, and they have at the very south what they call salt pans, which are being used to let the water evaporate, and then they are recovering the very rich minerals that have washed out from all the different rains and everything that have washed the minerals out of the hill country to the north. So, but I've not heard that there is going to be any kind of an archaeological dig, and what would remain there um, and would be subject to investigation at that point. But the Dead Sea, lowest place on Earth in terms of the elevation below sea level, I think it's something like about a third of a mile, 1,700 feet below sea level. I think it's somewhere in there, and it is part of an earthquake fault that goes all the way from the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia all the way down to the tip of Africa. A great earthquake that happened at one time, and this means that the water that flows in there, there is no place that it's going to flow out. It was also a very beautiful place, though, at one time, apparently. The whole Jordan Valley is quite a bit warmer even in the winter time than other places, and so there'll be a lot of crops that'll grow there, particularly in cities like Jericho. And so it at one time was very beautiful, but now any of you who have seen pictures of it or been there know that it's a very, very desolate area, and not a place that anybody would want to live now. So we break off at this point with seeing the destruction and the hand of God's wrath upon the wickedness of human beings. Again, we see through looking in kind of through a little window once in a while at the fact that God says, I do not tolerate, I do not put up with, I do not approve of all kinds of wickedness, and wickedness is going to be punished. And we ourselves are going to always plead like Abraham did for God to be merciful, but then we also need to recognize that God is God and not simply someone to be pushed around like we try to push someone and manipulate someone to get benefits for us. The wrath of God is not seen in its most important sense here, though. It's seen not with the fire and brimstone coming down upon peoples in a valley. It's seen on Good Friday when everything turns dark and God puts on himself the real punishment for all the sin of all human beings in all times, as he himself takes the consequences on himself. And even in the depth of these dark moments then within this story, which must have been a great shock to Abraham as well. We never hear anything about Lot after this, going back to Abraham or whatever, but he obviously would have lost all his possessions and all his wealth. Even at this time, there is the promise that God says, I'll be with you and I'll bless you. And even in those dark times, then Abraham can hold on to the fact that God had talked with him openly, had shared with him what was up, and had let him know that people are not going to be blessed by God because of their worth, and that that'll be just by his grace, but that there are also those who in their wickedness can bring trouble on themselves and on many others. It's a rather somber note to close with, but I would remind you that even in the midst of this, there is the mercy of God who says, I will keep my promises to Abraham and watch over him, and he keeps those promises to us as well. Thank you, and God's blessings to you as you continue your study of this book.